Hello everyone and welcome to Mnemonic's EHS webinar series. This webinar will touch upon internal audit best practices for safety, environment and quality audits. This webinar will outline the attributes of an outstanding internal audit program and show you how to build out a program tailored to your operations. But before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce Mnemonic as a company, my role here and our presenter for today. Mnemonic is a software service that provides EHS managers with the tools necessary to ensure environmental, health, safety, and quality compliance in their operations. Mnemonic is both a web service and an app that is designed to help auditors inspect their facilities for compliance issues, as well as stay on top of legal updates and maintain a legal register. My name is Jessica Minhas. I am the marketing manager here at Mnemonic, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation in the GoToWebinar question box, and we will gladly address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. To present this topic to us today, we have with us John Wolf, a Mnemonic partner and owner of Management Horizons. He has over 30 years of industry experience in automotive, nuclear, oil and gas, and chemical manufacturing sectors. He managed the ISO committee that developed the ISO 9000 and 14000 standards, but more recently, he was Senior Director of Operations Integrity Audit for Suncor Global Operations. He's also the founder of Conformance Check, which was recently acquired by Mnemonic. So that's all for the introductions. I'm happy to say that we have attendees from all over the world joining us today. Thank you all for participating. Without further ado, here is John Wolf on internal audit best practices.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. As you heard from the introduction, my expertise lies in the fields of health and safety, environment and quality management systems, risk management and auditing. So today's webinar is focused on some of the learnings that I have discovered about what a good internal audit program looks like. As part of that discussion, I'll be touching on some of the drivers for a good internal audit program, management system frameworks, where audit and assessment fits in, and the importance of being in regulatory compliance. We will also be looking at internal audit business process itself and the role that risk management and the identification and auditing of critical controls play in an effective audit program. Please note that some of the slides contain a lot of data that we don't have time to cover in detail. So if you want a copy of the presentation, it will be posted along with the supporting white paper on the Mnemonic website. I hope that through this webinar you will get a good sense of our passion to help organizations develop a compliance plus culture. But first, let's start with a safety moment. I happen to live just north of Toronto in an area that can get a lot of snow and ice in the winter. My vehicle had to go in for repairs for a couple of days and the dealership arranged for a rental. I did not do a proper risk assessment and accepted the vehicle they provided as is. From experience, I have learned to put high quality winter tires on all my vehicles as well as lead weights over the rear tires for added traction. The rental vehicle they provided had none, and my wife nearly got into a bad accident when she lost control of the car on black ice covered by snow. Luckily, there were no cars coming at her and she recovered control, but it was a significant near miss. When I raised the issue with the rental agency, they agreed that snow tires were needed, but to save money, they only put winter tires on their fleet in Quebec, where it was required by law. So I will not be renting from that agency again, and please ensure that all your vehicles that you or your employees rent are properly equipped with snow tires in this bad winter weather. So to begin today's session, why are we here? Well, there are a lot of drivers for a good internal health, safety, environment, quality audit program, but the chief one is the fact that safety performance remains an ongoing issue for most organizations, and the cost of initiatives to reduce those incidents is constantly rising, as are the actual costs of the incidents themselves. So when companies allocate their scarce resources of time and money, they need to be focused on the right initiatives. So what can we do to improve these trends? Well, a good management system and framework and safety culture are the required foundation in my mind. An internal audit can help determine the effectiveness of those programs. And as the lead of an internal audit program, you can be a powerful agent of change, making risk and opportunity transparent to senior leaders through an independent set of eyes. You can also be the key driver in improving the efficacy of your organization's business processes by including relevant management system requirements in your audits. And while sometimes the benefits to the company's bottom line are not immediately clear, seeing management act on your findings is one of the things I've found most rewarding in my career as an auditor. As you look at your audit program, I would also encourage you to look at the big picture of your operations, especially if you have hazardous operations. Most of you are probably familiar with the traditional personal safety pyramid, but high-performing organizations focus on both personal and process safety. They also look at low-frequency but high-consequence events. So support of your health, safety, and quality professionals is critical to ensure that they are enabling their frontline management to look for unsafe behaviors and ensure procedure adherence. And if you have prime contractors, you also need to make sure that they are doing the same things with the subcontractors on your behalf. Risk and control owners need to be clearly identified for the hazards in these pyramids, and both you and the risk owners need to look at the EHS performance data and trends to identify and reduce the number of precursor events through appropriate monitoring and audit programs. You need to check the checkers, not be the checker, and use your resources to audit the truly critical controls. As best practice, I would suggest an initial focus on those low frequency but high consequence company killer risks, along with audits of the efficacy of your management system and supporting governance programs to build competency and capacity for the businesses to look after those more traditional health and safety risks, especially the personal safety ones on their own. After you've addressed the known potential company killer risks, you can work your way down the food chain. The internal audit program does not work in isolation, and in operationally excellent companies, it is part of the overall health, safety, environment, and quality management system framework. And most organizations' management system frameworks are built on the plan, do, check, act, improve model that was developed by Deming back in the early 1980s and is now used by millions of companies around the world. The framework illustrated in this slide is from Suncor, and it has 18 elements and about 67 requirements within those 18 elements. Other companies have organized those requirements into as few as 10 elements, but the number of requirements within them is pretty consistent. Now, if you layer in requirements for process safety, you can add in a couple hundred more requirements, of course. I had the privilege of working with the ISO early in my career, managing the technical committees that developed the 9000 and 14000 series of management system standards on quality and environmental management, and also had the privilege of contributing to the OSHAST 18000 series on health and safety management. And if you are a small business, small company looking to upgrade your systems, these standards are a great place to start. There's no need to go to the expensive certification unless your customers demand it. Now, associated with the management system elements are, of course, all the supporting corporate and operations level policies, standards, guidelines, procedures, and work instructions. And operationally excellent companies, again, ensure that these documents are developed by subject matter experts, that they're clearly owned, that they're kept current, that they're deemed the one source of truth, and are made effective through training, competency checks, and audits. From the audit perspective, it is beneficial to have these documents be very clear on what are the mandatory requirements, the must-haves versus guidance or nice-to-haves. It's very hard to hold people accountable when the must-have requirements are not clear. This next slide makes the point that a great strategy or good documentation by itself, again, does not make a company organizationally effective. The missing ingredients are safety culture and operational discipline, competent individuals following business processes with good operational discipline, great health, safety, environment, and quality manuals that sit on a shelf having the dust blown off for an audit steal real value from any organization. So audits and assessments can play a critical role in providing assurance that that documentation is up to date, accurate, and that employees and contractors understand and follow them. Now, internal audit, like all the other health and safety, environment quality management system elements, are heavily interdependent on data inflows from other elements and is a data output to other elements such as corrective actions and management review. In this webinar, we're going to focus on compliance obligations and risk management as two of the key inputs, and corrective actions as the key data output, although all the elements show interdependency with audit and assessment at some level. So where do audits and assessments fit in? Well, again, using the pyramid analogy, the bulk of the assurance activity should take place at the base of the pyramid through management system requirements for ops and maintenance controls, quality assurance, inspection, and maintenance programs. This is your first and most important line of defense against incidents, and again, in high-performing organizations, your frontline team should be actively engaged in a robust program of monitoring and measuring and inspection programs. These programs are followed by a second line of defense, usually conducted by operations leadership or business process owners who manage broader self-assessment programs and compliance reviews. And finally, the third line of defense at the top of the pyramid, managed by operations integrity audit, internal audit, external auditors, and regulatory bodies. In terms of lessons learned, many businesses are concerned about audit fatigue and having the right lower level assurance programs and key performance indicators driven by those owners, and technical excellence networks can help focus your program on the issues that both parties agree require a corporate review and an independent set of eyes. In terms of lessons learned, again, one of the key recommendations I would make is the implementation of an annual management system self-assessment program. Many leading organizations also utilize maturity roadmaps as a way of measuring their progress in that continual improvement journey. And the maturity roadmap in this slide is a generic one for health and safety and environment programs. But at Suncor, we've developed maturity roadmaps for all 18 elements with a score of 1 to 5, with 1 as regressive, 2 as reactive, 3 as planned, 4 as proactive company best practice, and 5 as operationally excellent, sort of industry best practice. We had about 50 auditable units across the company, and each one had to conduct an annual management system self-assessment and address any performance gaps. To normalize the assessments, our internal audit team facilitated the first assessment in year 1, and the scores were under 2 for most elements and facilities across the company, which was a big shock for many parts of the business that had been scoring themselves at the 90% plus level in historic loss management programs. These scores were transparent right up to the board. The goal was a level 3 across operations by the 3rd year. The advantage of the program was it trained leadership on the importance of an operationally excellent management system, the value of audits, and it identified systemic and areas of individual weakness to be resourced and areas of best practice to be emulated and shared. I would encourage you to use audit software so you can easily compare sites and look at the records entered as evidence to justify their annual self-assessment rating when you come back on a 3 to 5 year cycle to validate it. Our team kept this process honest by including some or all of the elements in our regularly scheduled audit program. Another lesson is to play well with others in the sandbox. There are many other players in the assurance space, and again, I would recommend that you meet with your peers in finance, legal, and risk, and audit, finance audit, on an ongoing basis to ensure the consistency of risk and control messaging and audit program alignment. Understand your organization's business planning cycle and get yourself into their meeting agendas in a timely manner. That way, when you meet with senior leaders on operational risk, you also know what the other assurance functions have planned, and you can exploit any synergies and avoid duplication of effort. So let's look at the first key input into the audit function that I mentioned, compliance obligations. This element in a nutshell requires organizations to establish business processes to identify their obligations and then establish the necessary controls and programs needed to meet them. Meeting your compliance obligations should be your minimum performance expectation, and the information supporting that expectation is usually kept in a live data registry. Now, there are lots of good examples of effectively designed legal registries, but at a minimum they should document what is the obligation, how, why, and where is it applicable in your operations, what are the consequences of non-compliance, who is responsible for demonstrating compliance, what controls are in place and tasks are required to maintain compliance, are there any gaps, what are your gap closure plans, and what evidence do you have that you're in compliance. It is important to note that each element has its own plan, do, check, act cycle and is therefore auditable in its own right. Operationally excellent companies identify an expert owner for each business process and management system element, and these experts should be involved in the annual self-assessments of the efficacy of the implementation process that they own. So you should have somebody in your company, probably in the legal department, that owns the compliance obligation business process. And again, by including relevant management system requirements in your audit criteria and conducting full management system audits, you can help audit higher performance of these systems into existence. I would also recommend that you support the development of appropriate leading and lagging key performance indicators for each element to help drive performance improvement. And in the case of compliance obligations element, it's also beneficial to require senior leaders in operations to sign off on an annual letter of representation that states that they are aware of their compliance status and are actively closing any identified gaps. This level of felt accountability turns the audit function into an ally versus a policeman in their eyes, since you are helping protect them from the consequences of non-compliance. Also, in terms of best practice, not all regulations are created equal, and the internal audit team needs to focus on those that have the highest negative consequences for non-compliance. You can audit into existent good legal registries and software tools that are user-friendly and also contain audit criteria and checklists for pretty much every health, safety, federal, state, provincial, and provincial regulation are available. They're also simple to populate with customized criteria for company-specific permit and license type obligations. So please check out the software that is available and use it, especially for your legal requirements program. I would much rather audit the complete Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle for compliance obligations, keeping the responsibility for compliance evidence with the designated owner. Just support them with the right tools. Perhaps the most critical and foundational element of your health, safety, and environment quality management system framework addresses the business process for risk identification and management. It's probably the most key input into your audit planning process. The slide that I've used in this webinar illustrates the framework for risk management developed by the International Standards Organization. And again, if you're looking for a framework, that's a great place to start. Again, the Plan, Do, Check, Act philosophy applies, and the standard itself outlines methodologies to analyze and assess risks, treat them by putting controls in place to a nature and depth suitable to mitigate them to a level where the company can live with the risk. In terms of best practice, again, your auditors need to be well trained in risk management techniques, and you need to help the business generate good data by including the risk management element in most of your audits to help drive consistency and efficacy and data quality across the organization. There are lots of methods available to us to identify hazards and risks. Those include things like brainstorming, field level risk assessments, job safety analysis, what ifs, HAZOP studies, failure mode effects analysis, process hazard analysis, layers of protection analysis, etc. But the learning that I would impart here is that there's need for lots and lots of training and facilitation by experts. If you don't do that, you'll pollute your risk data, and the old saying of data garbage in equals data garbage out, and management won't trust or use the data the way that it's intended. The other thing to look for here is when auditing the efficacy of your risk management business process is that the depth of the analysis is commensurate with the risk potential consequences. For a level 1 process safety risk, a what if really doesn't cut it, and you expect to see PHAs and more advanced techniques like layers of protection analysis. The other key thing to look at here is the use of a risk matrix. The one that I've shown here is pretty much blank. Typically, you would add in risk receptors in 4 groups, usually safety, environment, economic, and reputational. You can make them fit for purpose. For example, in some companies, a high consequence level 6 might be 100 million for the economic receptor, and in smaller companies it might only be 1 million. This model uses a 6x6 matrix with consequence ratings ranging from 1 to 6, with a 1 being minimal impact to 6 being catastrophic, running horizontally, and likelihood ratings ranging from 1, very likely, to 6, extremely rare, running vertically. So for illustrative purposes, let's pick a rare event with some nasty consequences. If you operate a pipeline, one of the worst potential risks is a large spill to a sensitive ecosystem such as a lake or ocean. The main receptors are, in this case, environment, economic, and reputation. And the inherent risk without controls is high both in terms of its likelihood and high in terms of its consequence. Potentially billions of dollars in cleanup costs, fines, shares, lost value, and of course reputation. These scenarios place the risk somewhere in that upper right quadrant in the red as an unacceptable level 1 risk. The intent then is to look at the controls we have in place and see if they are of a nature and depth sufficient to lower that likelihood of occurrence and the potential severity to the extent that we can move the risk down to the lower left quadrant of the matrix into the orange, yellow, and green section to become a level 2, 3, or 4 ranked risk. For example, we might start with the design of the pipeline, the route selected, the quality and thickness of the steel used, the quality of welds, the type of pipeline coating, the implementation of a pipeline integrity program, smart pigging, regular inspections, leak detection programs, or emergency response programs, etc. With such controls in place, the residual risk may be deemed acceptable. You should score all your risk perceptors in most cases and then select the one with the highest rating. In terms of best practice, again, lots of training and quality checks of the interpretation and use of the matrix will help generate better and more consistent data across the company. And using the matrix as a heat map will also show to your clients the inherent risk and the residual risk, and it's a great audit and planning support tool. Another key concept in good audit planning is the hierarchy of controls philosophy and understanding the dynamics of an incident. The most effective controls are those, of course, that eliminate the risk. And the next most effective controls are those engineering controls that you can add, such as adding machine guards, interlocks, or barriers, or changing a process. For example, the electronics industry a number of years ago moved from using hazardous solvents to clean circuit boards to a water-based cleaning system, totally eliminating the need for hazardous materials. And next in the hierarchy are administrative controls such as operating procedures, training, and of course the last resort is personal protective equipment. So in terms of auditing and best practice, if you look at an operations risk registry and you're planning out your audits and you see a level 1 risk, what should you be looking for in terms of control adequacy? Well, the nature and depth of those controls, again, should be commensurate with the potential consequences. So you should be looking for a lot of engineering controls and really tight administrative controls. And in some organizations, you actually score and give credits for those lines of defense. And again, if you've got that in an electronic system, it's a simple way to check on the adequacy controls by both you and the risk control owner. So you want to look for a lot of engineering controls, a lot of really tight administrative controls. In terms of lessons learned, again, if you look at good root cause analysis as a way to reverse engineer a significant incident, then you also have a good tool to help identify that full mix of critical controls you should be including in the scope of your audit. Now, there are many templates available to capture risk data, but most capture at a minimum what is the risk being addressed, where is it located and who owns it, what's its inherent risk rating without controls, what are the existing control treatments or barriers, a description of that control type, the residual risk rating after those controls have been applied, and then a determination of risk acceptance or plan of action to add more controls. This data becomes a critical input into the discussion around what needs to be audited by the risk control owner and possibly by the internal audit team. And again, lots of different templates available and software available. What you don't want to do is have a ton of Excel spreadsheets across your company. It is better to try and get it into one enterprise database so that you can keep the information live and continually improve it over time. But nothing wrong with starting with Excel spreadsheets as a good place to start. These risk registries become a very important audit planning and business planning tool in your company if you do it right. And here we see yet another pyramid. And the bulk of activity and ownership in high-performing organizations, of course, is again at the base. Operations managers should utilize the risk management processes we just talked about to create business-level risk inventories that identify potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of level 4, 3, 2, and 1, or potentially some level 1 risks. These inventories should be consolidated into operations level risk registries at the director or VP level, showing the level 1 and 2 risks in their operations. This bottoms-up process should be complemented by a top-down principal risk validation process where the level 1 risks are shared with the executive and the board, and they're really asked if there's anything else that keeps them awake at night. If the risk data is good, these risk registries become an important tool in the annual business planning process and budgeting process to close control gaps, and of course for the assurance programs to assess the efficacy of the critical controls identified. And again, the intent here is you should have a clear line of sight from your perhaps top 10 risks at the executive level all the way down to what makes those principal risks, those level 1 risks, where you see them reflected in the lower level risk registries within the organization. So let's look at the audit process flowchart itself. Generally, most companies divide the process into 3 components: an upfront planning and communication process, an on-site data gathering and client communication process, and a post-on-site process which involves the creation of the draft and final reports, its communication, and follow-up of any causal analysis and proposed corrective and preventative actions. In the white paper that supports the presentation, I laid out a more detailed business process flow for internal audit. And the guidance that I would give here is to formalize your program where it makes sense. Set up folders for each audit and implement quality checklists to ensure adequate and timely communication to your clients. Manage your work in progress data, your draft and final reports, track the causal analysis and corrective action follow-up and audit closure. Standardized templates are great, and weekly team calls and monthly review of plan versus actual for audits, all audits in play, will help keep the program on track and identify any issues that your lead auditors need help or guidance on. If you're conducting audits under legal privilege, you will also need to put tight wording and distribution controls on all communications right from the planning stage on. And just because the audit may have been conducted under privilege, you can still work with legal to communicate any lessons learned that need to be shared. So this is a case of walking the talk. Your own program should be audited. At Suncor, our program was audited externally once every 5 years to ensure, again, that the same level of performance expectation that we were expecting from everybody else, we were doing ourselves. So let's move on now to some frequently asked questions. I often get asked, where should the internal audit function report? And I think where it reports is not as important as long as the leadership team supports the audit program and its independence. Ideally, it should be as high as possible in the organization to support independence, transparency, and resourcing. I was very lucky. I actually reported straight to the EHS chair of the board for health, safety, and sustainable development. I know most people report through to a VP EHS or a VP operations, and again, it doesn't really matter where, as long as you get the support that you need. The audit program lead should be supported by a small team of trained auditors, preferably with operations experience, and the program should have a budget adequate to complete the scheduled audits and employ outside experts where required. And that's important, especially if you're doing very complicated audits. Perhaps you're doing facility siting and you need experts on blasts and toxics, or you're looking at safety instrumented systems or alarm management programs. Those are probably areas where you want to bring external experts to help you out with. You should also have the budget to support the use of a pool of trained volunteer auditors from operations. Being able to pay at least some of their expenses goes a long way in helping them sell their management on participation. These guest auditors should be invited on audits of like facilities where they have an opportunity to network, set up excellence networks, and share best practices. It also gives them firsthand experience to expect when their facility is audited, and gives you a chance to see if you want to recruit any of them as full-time auditors. We offered training 3 or 4 times a year, anything from 1 day sort of self-assessment to capability training through to 3-day training, and had a pool of about 200 auditors trained across the company, and probably drew from about 40 within that pool. Another common question is, how often should I audit? For good due diligence defense, if the audit frequency should be risk-based, you need to define your auditable units. And when you do that, you need to make sure there are no orphan children left without clear owners. And you often see that when you start to look at a given auditable unit or a given function. A lot of things can slip between the cracks. You know, things like feeder pipelines or some of the support functions and services. If your organization has been changing a lot, sometimes the ownership of those gets lost. You need to look at the complexity of the operations, their compliance history, their self-assessment scores, incident history, and their physical setting. For example, if you've got hazardous operations in a highly populated or environmentally sensitive area, all those things flow into a risk evaluation and justification for how often you want to audit a given facility. Again, I would recommend a 3-year cycle for hazardous operations and a 5 to 7 year frequency for non-hazardous operations. As the audit leader, you'll spend a lot of time and energy in the selection of audit targets and the controls to be used in your audit. This process should retain its alignment to your organization's strategy, to its value drivers and principal risks, and be consultative with the affected business units and functions. Within that timeline, think of the inputs to the audit planning process as a funnel, taking into account what's happening in the industry in terms of governance focus, the actual performance and incident history of your auditable units, the corporate principal and operations-specific risk and control registries, their legal registries, etc. So all those things are getting considered over time. You know, when you last saw them, what the resourcing is. I tried to maintain an active 5 to 7 year cycle of base load management system audits. Again, 3 years for auditable units with hazardous operations, 5 for non-hazardous, and I left lots of room for risk-based selection of specific risk and control audits for specific operations in any given year. Our team conducted about 30 audits per year with a heavy focus on process safety, and all the audits included a review of the auditable units' annual management system self-assessment data and any other relevant audits or assessments they might have undertaken to avoid duplication of effort and to follow up on the effectiveness of their corrective actions. In terms of best practice, again, I would recommend that you maintain an active watch list of proposed audits that you review collaboratively with your clients on an annual basis. This gives them a heads up, and they will often actively improve their control regimes between the time you first discussed it with them and when you actually did the audit a year or so later, or in fact may not ever get around to it, but they've improved their process despite that. You should also leave room for industry sector driven programs. For example, when the BP Macondo incident happened, there was an immediate push to ensure that all the risks identified in that incident were well managed in our operations, and perhaps even more interesting, that our risk controls over joint ventures, where we were the non-operating partner, were also adequate. So sometimes things happen in your industry, and you need to leave room in your audit program to address those as well. Of course, you should always retain the right in any given year to audit a given operation at a higher frequency based on their actual performance. Once you've selected your potential audit targets, I would also highly recommend that you use a technique called bow tie analysis when you select the critical controls to be assessed. In this type of analysis, on the left-hand side of the page here, you see threat causes and the preventative and operational controls used. In the middle, you have the business activity or risk event being considered. And on the right-hand side of the page, you have the response and recovery controls and the potential consequences. This methodology helps you visualize what controls are critical to either prevent the event from happening, to reduce its impact, and recover quickly from it. The bow ties are also a very powerful training and communication tool with the audit client and audit team to help explain why you are auditing specific controls. In terms of audit scheduling, more communication is better. Your time is valuable and the operations team time is valuable. So spend the time up front to ensure that you have a good place to work on site to work, that interview rooms and opening, exit and closing meeting conference rooms are booked, and that you have invited the senior leaders to them and it's in their schedules, that you pre-qualify for all site safety and orientation requirements. And in terms of best practice, you should ensure, again, senior leaders attend those opening, exit, and closing meetings, clearly expressing support for the audit and its findings. Adequate notice is important so there are no surprises. In most well-run audits, the team lead will usually request information to be sent to the audit team as background and familiarization prior to the audit. Suggested items include a process overview, facility layout, simplified organization charts showing the names of key people that should be participating in the audit, and of course site area, standards, guidelines, procedures, work instructions, and records relevant to the audit itself, as well as a copy of the most recent audit or other investigations and status of the recommendations for them. When on site, you should try to work standard site hours and communicate potential findings daily to ensure that there are no surprises and to give the site time to direct you to any additional data that they might be aware of that you missed. The key thing here is to give the site time to prepare and keep time in the schedule for flexibility in chasing down all the facts needed to back up a potential finding. The more time you spend up front in the planning stage, the easier the audit is going to go. Also of interest, the elements of the management system itself can be looked at through the same lens of preventive and recovery controls. For example, if you're doing a pipeline integrity audit and you wanted one of your auditors to look at leak detection programs, you might ask the auditor to look at the adequacy of the risk registries under normal, abnormal, emergency condition to see whether they had identified all of the risks associated with leak detection. You check to make sure that the legal registries had all relevant compliance obligations in them. You check under training to see whether they'd identified all the critical positions and competency requirements and had the records to back up competency of people involved in relevant procedures. You'd want to make sure that all the leak detection protocols and records were there. So it's just another interesting way to look at the management system and its importance as you pick out your audit criteria. You also need to spend a lot of time training your lead auditors on how to write a good fact-based findings within the context of a standardized report format. The draft report should be issued within 2 to 3 weeks after the audit, and a final report issued after you have addressed any comments from the client. I would recommend that you include best practice observations in the report as well as other observations did not reach formal non-compliance status. So a little bit of good with the bad. What rating systems you use is not as important as what happens with the data. You need to ensure that significant findings are escalated high enough in the organization to have the corrective action resourced adequately. Unacceptable ratings should be transparent to the executive and the board, and your award and recognition systems should not penalize the leaders of those operations for having significant findings, again, unless you see an unacceptable number of incidents and report incidents under that management. Once you've submitted your final report and presented its findings to the client, It's incumbent upon them to conduct causal analysis to a nature and depth, again commensurate with the potential consequences of the findings. Using standardized methodology and software like Taproot or Reason will help, and you should ensure that the analysis focuses on system failures and not individuals or equipment. If you think the finding is systemic, you should also make it clear in your report so that the client checks for the same control issue in other affected parts of their operation and doesn't just treat the isolated control failure identified. In normal situations, I would recommend that you should not provide recommendations since you place yourself in conflict, but if your programs are immature, you may find that the benefits of providing recommendations does outweigh that conflict. You should also reject inadequate corrective and preventive actions and follow up on the efficacy of closed corrective actions or interim actions if the operation has to delay plans until they shut down operations to do a big turnaround. Another best practice is to ensure that the proposed corrective actions and closeout of corrective actions is signed off by at least one level higher than the actual owner of the action. That will prevent a lot of issues. I also often get asked about audit software. We live in a world of big data, and operationally excellent companies must embrace technology. What is exciting for me is the growth in the smaller app space versus the big enterprise systems. And while both are important, the more tools you can put in the frontline leadership hands to do housekeeping inspections and procedure adherence observation programs, behavior observation programs, toolbox talks, the more you will have a better chance of building a good safety culture and cut down on those precursor events that precede significant events that we talked about earlier. Audit software can, of course, also cut down on the time and cost of conducting inspections, assessments, and audits. So look at, there are a lot of products out there in the marketplace. Take a look and choose one that works for you. You can also access about 1,500 free checklists on the Mnemonics site, and if you have some best practices yourself, please share them with us as well. So in summary, a great health, safety, environment, quality audit program, internal audit program, can be improved with some of the following items. A robust, continually improving health, safety, environment, quality management system framework that facilitates the identification of and ownership of risks and opportunities and supportive controls. Strong supportive leadership that sees health, safety, environment, quality, performance, and excellence as one of the keys to overall corporate performance. Robust monitoring and self-assessment programs by frontline and business unit risk and control owners with leading performance metrics that drive desired outcomes. An internal audit function with budget, staff, and expertise commensurate with the nature and depth of the health, safety, and quality risk control maturity that they see. Involvement of outside experts where credibility and expertise are required. Good data analytics and automation, a risk-based audit program design that focuses on critical controls and business processes, robust investigation, causal analysis, and gap closure follow-up, audit results and analysis reporting to senior management and the board for full transparency, and a collaborative continual improvement philosophy with your clients. And finally, the last slide. If you operate a business, there will always be risk. This simple slide makes the point that there are trade-offs. Management gets paid to determine a company's risk tolerance and appetite. Your job as the key agent of change and governance is to present the facts so that they can make informed decisions on risks and control efficacy and hence allocate scarce resources. If you do that effectively, you and your team will be seen as a value-added function to the company. And that frees us up for any questions. Thank you.
So thank you, John, for that incredibly informative session on internal audit best practices. It is time for question and answers. So please drop down any last-minute questions that you might have, and I will then proceed to share these with John. But before I do, I would like to quickly point out that Mnemonic would love to be part of your efforts to improve your regulatory compliance. Please feel free to give us a call or send us an email for more information. With that in mind, we will tackle a few questions. So we have a question here from Rob, John. Rob says, Safety culture is indicated by the everyday behaviors of people. How can internal audit get to understand these behaviors that are happening when they are not there? Documents and what you see in a visit do not necessarily indicate the culture.
Right. So, so I guess there's a couple of things that internal audit can do. One is include in their audit program mix periodic audits where you actually go out and do the behavior observations and you check for procedure adherence. Certainly, when all our auditors are walking along and on site, they're doing that as part of the audit. And the other thing to do is to support, as we said, those support that frontline management. That's really where you want to drive risk and control ownership. You want those frontline managers to be supporting the safety culture, and of course you've got to make sure that the leaders are involved and actively supporting the safety culture as well. So get them out on your audits as well and have them communicate the importance.
Well, thank you, John, for that answer. We have a lot of questions. John, would you like to go to the next slide? So just in case we are not able to cover the questions in the webinar today, they can send us. Thank you. So I have the next question here from Robert, who says, where can we go to see examples of risk registries?
We could post a couple of examples on the Monic site. Sure, no problem. I'll post 3 or 4 good examples.
All right, so Robert, John would post a few examples on the mnemonic website and we will let you know. So we have a comment here from Tom. Tom says, I believe the audit frequency of 5 to 7 years for non-hazardous operations, say in a manufacturing environment, may be too infrequent. One has to consider employee turnover, change in regulations, etc.
Yeah, that's, and again, you know, we did 5 to 7 years in our operations just because we had so many globally. We had 50 auditable units. If you have 5 auditable units or 1 or 2, you know, you need to be doing audits every year. So it is that risk-based frequency. The other thing that we fell back on was the fact that we had a very robust self-assessment program, which was conducted annually. So that gave us data that if there were issues or problems, we could come back in on a higher frequency in any case. So again, it is risk-based, and yes, if you've got the resources and can do it more frequently, absolutely.
Thank you, John, for that question. We have another question from Preston. John, why not make recommendations after the audit?
Well, you can put yourself in a conflict of interest position, and what I found is if we gave recommendations in our audit, often they just ran with that, thinking, well, you know, that's all that the auditor said that we had to do, so, and that's all they'll check when they come back. So, you know, that's as far as we go. So you want them to do that very robust causal analysis and look for systemic issues and you know, drive to the true root causes so that the corrective actions are robust. So that's the trade-off you make. You know, if they do a good job in their causal analysis and treat your recommendations as just that, but still do their own in-depth analysis, that's great. But that's the risks that you do take.
All right, thank you, John. I hope that answers your question, Preston. We have another question from Ulufunzo. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right. What is the best way to interview management? Do you do it individually or gather all the management body in a room?
It depends on what the criteria are, but generally speaking, most of the audits interviews are done individually. If you're looking at a particular business process where there's a number of senior leaders involved, you might interview them as a group. But generally speaking, most of the audit interviews are one-on-one.
All right, and there's another question. What do you see as the most important issue in the design of an operationally excellent program? This one is from Ed. Thank you, Ed, for the question.
Yeah, I think it's that that the risk-based selection of the right criteria, which is kind of why I focused in on the management system elements, the hierarchy of controls, the dynamics of an incident. You know, if you choosing the right control criteria is really the heart of a good audit. And if you get that right, if you choose the right risks and the right controls, then you're going to add value to the assessment and determining the efficacy of those controls.
Sure. I hope that answers your question, Ed. We have one question from Martin here. ISO 19011 is supposedly in the process of being revised. Do you have any information on the types of changes to expect and the timing of the final revision publication?
No, I wouldn't want to give wrong information. I would suggest that you go to the ISO site and to the posting by that committee, and they provide ongoing updates on the proposed changes, where they sit, and the timing of them. So that's probably the best place for people to go. And again, I think they are driving more towards you know, a risk-based approach, kind of that bow tie approach that I had talked about within plannings. Okay.
We have a question from Christy here. What do you recommend as the key initial task to develop as an internal EHS audit program for a mid-sized company with hazardous operations that does not yet have a program?
I would say use the ISO standards for risk management identification. You know, presumably you already have a process safety plan in place. You probably need a good self-assessment program associated with that, and then within that, once you've developed, once you've gone through your analysis and develop some risk registries, you know, look at the things that are the big company killers and work your way down from there. So look at your highest process safety risks and look at the controls associated with those as your top priority.
Sure. We have a question from Carol. Including environmental laws in audit programs, would you source legal experts or use in-house knowledge? What is an ideal resource mix?
I would make it really depends on the strength of your internal team. And again, if you go through that process, your minimum expectation should be you're in regulatory compliance and you're meeting all your compliance obligations. And we use the term compliance obligations because that also includes things like license and permit requirements, or obligations, commitments that you might have made to, say, First Nations, which can be just as important as legal obligations. So I would rely on your in-house team for most of that, but where the regulation might be open to interpretation, or you know that you have compliance issues, you may want to involve outside legal counsel to help protect you. And again, anything that you do in that regard, you may want to do under privilege and confidentiality, and you basically have to manage that right from the planning stage to protect yourself.
Thank you, John, for the answer. We have another question. We actually have many questions, but we'll try to cover as many as we can. We have a question here from Jolene. What would be some suggestions on integrating audit efforts from different groups, such as EHS, quality, risk, accounting?
Yeah, I think the main job is your job as lead is it is a lot of liaison, communication, coordination. So what I tried to do was get myself invited to their regularly monthly, quarterly business planning meetings and become kind of a set item on their agenda where I could share what we were planning to do across the company and issues that we were seeing. And then we could coordinate with them. And we did do some audits with internal audit jointly, some with quality jointly. It really just depends on the opportunity, but the more you know about what they're doing and the more they know about what you're doing, the better it is for the company. It means more alignment and better focus on the priorities for the company.
Sure. There's a question from Timothy. Folks in the field tend to be very busy at times. How can EHS auditors best prepare them for an audit without jeopardizing the results?
And again, this gets back to the more preparation you do in advance, the better the audit's going to go. So if it's clear to the auditee what criteria you're going to be using, what records you're going to be looking for in advance, and why you're looking for those records, or why you're interviewing for a particular work instruction or guideline, the better it's going to go. The lower you go in the organization, the more intimidating the audit often is, and people get very nervous. You really need to make sure that they understand that you're not looking at them, you're looking at a business process, you're looking at a system, that's really what your focus is.
Sure. Thank you, John. I'm going to take 3 more questions, but I would just like to point out that we would be able to answer all of the questions. We're running out of time now. We just have 4 minutes, so I have 3 questions ready. But if you have any questions, please send us an email at info@mnemonic.com, and John will answer your questions personally in an email. So the question for you, John, is how did you decide whether to accept the proposed corrective actions to your findings? This one is from Bora.
I was very lucky. We had very highly qualified engineers, kind of experts on my audit team, who could look at a proposed corrective action and its associated causal analysis and give it that sniff test. It was really up, of course, to the actual risk and control owner and auditee client to make the final call. But if it didn't smell right, we would certainly send it back and make suggestions for what they might want to do to improve the quality of that causal analysis and corrective action.
Sure. And next question is from Mariam. She says, did you ever do joint audits for the financial side of internal audit?
The answer is yes. In some cases, and where that comes into play is often on looking at the efficacy of a business process within a function, say training or supply chain, or maybe it might be looking at say IT security, where they would come in and look to see whether all the software defenses in say a refinery were secure. Well, we might look at the safety instrument systems themselves or alarm management. They'd be doing penetration tests to see whether or not those systems could be hacked. So it really depends on the opportunity, but there certainly are opportunities to do joint audits with the finance side.
All right. The last question, John, and let's make this a quick one. This one is from Edward. If during the process of internal audit there is found that operation, mining in my case, is lacking on SOPs, what do you think is the best way to close this issue, by having or producing the SOPs internally or getting external help?
Really depends on your resourcing and expertise. It's always better to do it internally if you can, because then there's better ownership. But if you need it done quickly or you don't have the expertise, then nothing wrong with having it done externally, as long as the lessons are kind of shared by that external provider, so that you're building competency and capacity in your organization to do it going forward.
Sure. Thank you, John. I think I would take that as the last question for today. There are so many more questions being asked. Please do send us an email with your questions at info@mnemonic.com, and John will be able to answer your questions personally in an email. So thank you so much for asking these very interesting questions, and thank you, John, for giving us this informative presentation. Please note that we will send you a copy of the slides as well as a recording of this presentation later today or at the beginning of the day tomorrow. So one last big thank you to everyone. Have a great day, and we will hopefully hear from you soon.